Today, it's a grab bag of Orioles topics, from Jeff Hoffman failing a physical with another team, the Orioles making the roster moves on the 40-man, DFA'ing a couple of interesting young players, John Means potentially coming back to Baltimore, and how Roki Sasaki could impact the Orioles, even though he won't be signing in Baltimore. That's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Tuesday, January 14th, 2025, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb, and coming up on today's episode, it's an Orioles news and notes pod. We've got a whole bag of topics to get to. We'll talk about Blake Hunt. We'll talk about Liván Soto. We'll talk about Jeff Hoffman, John Means, Roki Sasaki, and a whole lot more coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by FanDuel. From big upsets to game-winning drives, the NFL playoffs are better with FanDuel. And new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets, guaranteed, win or lose. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started today. So we will kick things off on this Orioles news and notes episode with a little bit more talk about Jeff Hoffman. Now, if you checked out Sunday's episode, and I implore you to do so, whether you're watching here on the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, or you are listening wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever it may be. Please leave a 5-star rating and a review if you can. That episode was there as well. We talked about the interesting news that came out late last week about Jeff Hoffman, who had signed a 3-year, $33 million deal with the Toronto Blue Jays to be their closer. And Hoffman was, I would argue, I mean, you could say it's Tanner Scott, but I would argue Jeff Hoffman, the best reliever on the free agent market this offseason. And then reporting came out after that deal was announced with the Blue Jays that the Orioles had actually initially agreed to a 3-year, $40 million contract with Hoffman. But after reviewing his physicals, they saw an issue in his throwing shoulder, tried to basically renegotiate, say, hey, we see an issue. We think with that shoulder issue, you're maybe not worth 3 years, not worth $40 million, tried to renegotiate. And instead, the Blue Jays still offered him 3 years, which would feel like the O's probably dropped their deal to 2 years. And that's why Hoffman ended up signing with Toronto. And we talked about how it could be a myriad of things that the Orioles saw. A lot of teams do their physicals, look at things differently with different doctors. But then we got some more interesting news because Mark Bowman, who covers the Braves at MLB.com, reported on Monday that Hoffman, even before he agreed with the Orioles, it seems like, he had agreed on a contract, which you don't know the details of yet, with the Atlanta Braves. Now, there is some reporting that was closer to a 4 or 5 year deal with Atlanta for Hoffman, but that he also took a physical. And we, again, don't know exactly what the Braves saw, but that he initially failed that Braves physical and that deal fell through. He then agreed with the Orioles, failed that physical, and finally, third time's a charm, signed with the Toronto Blue Jays. Now, I don't think Bowman's reporting specifically had anything to do with what they saw, but you'd have to assume the O's saw an issue with the shoulder. The Braves, you would think, saw the same issue with Hoffman's throwing shoulder. Now, again, I know there were some people who were like, oh, this was just Mike Elias trying to back out of a deal. He made something up. Why would you agree to a 3-year, $40 million deal in the first place if the very next day when the physical is taken, you're then going to flip-flop your mind? That's not what happened. And it wasn't Elias trying to lowball Hoffman. He clearly saw something, and they clearly wanted the player because they still tried to negotiate afterwards and didn't just throw it away. And also, if you had any sort of weird, unfounded speculation about the Orioles' foul play in this, now that we know that another respectable and winning organization, the Atlanta Braves, also went through the same exact process, that tells you everything you need to know at this point. Like, there's a real issue, you would think, in that shoulder. And maybe it doesn't mean Hoffman's going to get surgery right now or start the season on the injured list. But again, it's just going to be something to monitor in 2025 with the Blue Jays. If he starts to lose velocity, if he starts to lose effectiveness, if he does go on the injured list, if there is any kind of talk of a shoulder issue, It's certainly something we are going to be monitoring, and there's no guarantee this is some sort of long-term issue that's going to end Hoffman's career. And we talked about how good he's been. He's been a lockdown. I mean, no doubt top 5 reliever in baseball over the past 2 years at the back end of the Phillies bullpen. But if there's an issue there, you maybe don't want to commit to a relief pitcher. And clearly the Braves and the Orioles agreed there. And it does. I mean, again, I talked about it on Sunday. I would have loved to have Jeff Hoffman in this Oriole bullpen and potentially, eventually, maybe in 2026 and 7 in the Oriole rotation as well. But at the end of the day, like, the Braves doing this too, and they need pitching, maybe even more than the Orioles do. The fact that they looked at that physical and said no makes me, and probably makes you, feel a little better. Like, wow, there's a serious issue. And this was just unfortunate for the Orioles, who did want to go and get a player. And the reporting was that the Orioles pretty quickly pivoted to Andrew Kittredge. And that tells me, at least for the first year, the Orioles are going to use Jeff Hoffman at the back end of the bullpen. So they went and got a cheaper option in Andrew Kittredge, signing him to a 1-year, $10 million deal with a team option for 2026 as well. Broke that down on Friday's episode, if you want to go back and check that one out as well. But when they pivoted to that, they made that move, and it was announced, or not announced, it was reported by Ken Rosenthal on Friday, but we did not get an announcement. It seemed like some of that was just with the weekend coming up. The O's weren't able to do the physical until later. Matt Wayrich of the Baltimore Sun reported the physical was going to be done on Monday, and Kittredge did officially pass that physical. So we had to wait a little bit for the Orioles to officially announce that move, but they did. But in the meantime, we knew, hey, they have to make a 40-man roster move because their 40-man roster was full. So somebody would have had to got DFA'd. And I talked about it on Thursday's episode last week. I kind of did my top 5 power rankings of most likely players on the 40-man to get DFA'd next when the Orioles make a move. And I had Brian Baker at number 1 and Emmanuel Rivera at number 2. Both of them survived. But number 3 and 4 on my list were both DFA'd over the weekend. We'll get to the first one right now, and that is catcher Blake Hunt, who is number 3 on my list, and he was designated for assignment on Monday to make room for Kittredge. Now, Hunt was not in the Orioles organization for super long. When the Orioles DFA'd Mike Baumann last May, they were actually able to work out a trade with the Seattle Mariners that sent Baumann over to Seattle, and they got Hunt back in the deal, which was nice for the O's to get something back for a player that they were going to lose for nothing. Now, Hunt was a guy who at times was a somewhat well-known prospect, and he was involved in the Blake Snell deal at one time and made his way over to Seattle, and people liked him as a bat, and there was differences of opinion about his catching ability behind the plate, but he got himself to AAA, and he had a 123 WRC plus in the first month and change in AAA Tacoma, which is the Seattle affiliate. He was traded to the Orioles, and he did spend some time as the Orioles taxi squad catcher, so he wasn't like in Norfolk all year, which is why he didn't get as many plate appearances. And you have to remember there were other catchers down there. Matt Vercanley, eventually Samuel Basayo got up there. But Hunt got 160 plate appearances with Norfolk, and there was just no offensive profile to speak of. He hit just 179, 219, 278. I mean, he was an okay catcher behind the plate, but just no production at all. That is a 24 WRC plus with a 31% strikeout rate and just a 4% walk rate for Hunt. There's still possibilities for him. He's 25 or 26 at this point. Like he's still nearing his prime baseball age, and there's still a chance for him to get to the big leagues, which he has not done yet with any of his organizations. But the reason why I had him number 3 on that list of guys most likely to get DFA next is just the Orioles brought in Gary Sanchez, so they have their backup catcher. And even though Hunt was right now the front runner to be that number 3 catcher, kind of the next guy you call on if there's an injury, when he performed that poorly in Norfolk last year, and the O's went most of last year with only 2 catchers on their 40-man roster, so you know they were willing to do it this year as well. That's what makes the Hunt move make sense. And also, he was so bad with Norfolk that even though he does have minor league options that he's never debuted, like, I think there's a good chance nobody claims him. He clears waivers and gets to remain in the O's organization in AAA Norfolk and just not hold up a 40-man roster spot. I think there's a chance someone could claim him, but I think with as bad as he was, he'll stick around. The O's will continue to work with him. He'll still be a candidate to be that number 3 catcher who's in Norfolk ready to come up at any time. But yeah, it was kind of a tough sledding down the stretch for him, and he does lose his 40-man roster spot. But we continue on with the Orioles news and notes. Let's talk about somebody who has actually played for the Baltimore Orioles for quite a while now, despite some injury concerns, and that is John Means, who is now a free agent. We've talked a little bit about his possibility of coming back to Baltimore and where he stands because he's going to miss a lot of time this year. Well, we had a report from Roki Sasaki of MASN this week that said, hey, do not rule out a John Means return. So we'll talk about that coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. From big upsets to game-winning drives, the NFL playoffs are better with FanDuel. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. The FanDuel app gives you everything you need for live bets, same-game parlays, and so much more. So if you look at that FanDuel site, obviously you're probably eyeing up the 4 divisional round NFL playoff games this weekend. And I got to say, like, they're calling Ravens at Bills one of the matchups of the century in the divisional round. That line at FanDuel is, maybe at most Ravens -1, maybe it's even Bills -1, like whatever it is, Ravens money line. Like they've got Derrick Henry, they've got Lamar Jackson. I feel this is the Super Bowl year. So just visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. So we continue on with our Orioles news and notes episode. Let's talk a little bit about John Means, because Roki Sasaki over at MASN reported on Sunday that the Orioles, quote, have not closed the door on John Means, and, quote, it would be a mistake to downplay their interest. Re-signing him is a possibility. That's what Rock wrote on Sunday. And it's interesting to think about because, as we know, John Means had his second Tommy John surgery in the span of 26 months back in June. He got the first TJ in May of 2022, missed that whole season, was supposed to come back in the middle of 2023, then had a setback with his back, didn't return until September of 2023, made 4 starts down the stretch, looked good, but then came up with more elbow soreness. The Orioles shut him down. He was not on the postseason roster in 2023. Then the O's wanted to make sure he was right, so they slow played his spring training. He was not ready for opening day. He did not debut until May of 2024. Then he made a handful of more starts and felt the elbow injury again in St. Louis and got another Tommy John surgery in June. So timeline for Means, if everything went sparkling, you'd put him on track to return like right after the All-Star break in late July at the earliest. That feels like the absolute earliest return. More likely is August or September. And honestly, there's a chance John Means does not pitch at all in the big leagues in 2025 if there's any kind of setback that comes up at any time. And when Means got the Tommy John back in June, this is an episode a while ago, you can go back and check it out for a further breakdown, but I kind of talked about it and looked at some of the Tommy John data and discussed how uncommon it is for a pitcher to make a successful return from not only just 2 Tommy Johns. Like, guys have come back from getting 2 career Tommy Johns. You'll see pitchers who like get it in high school or college and then again get it in pro ball but still pitch in the majors. But I specifically wanted to look at guys who got 2 Tommy Johns in a 3-year span or less. And that is what Means did with the 26 or 27 months between his TJ surgeries. And besides John Means, there were really only 4 players who have even gotten their way back to the big leagues, basically, to make any kind of impact after 2 Tommy Johns in a 3-year span. They are Cole Ragans, currently the ace of the Royals staff, Daniel Hudson, reliever, who just retired, Drew Rasmussen, who is now with the Tampa Bay Rays and just got a contract extension, and Jose Soriano, who is a young right-handed starter with the Angels. Those are the only 4 who have gotten 2 Tommy Johns less than 3 years apart and have come back to make some impact at the big league level. And here is what all of those players have in common. When all 4 of those guys got the second of those 2 Tommy John surgeries, all of them were 26 or younger. And honestly, Hudson was 26. The rest of them were like 21 or 22 when they got the second Tommy John. So they were much younger and had not even hit their prime yet. John Means was 31 years old when he got that second Tommy John surgery. That is a very different timeline for a guy who you could say was already past his prime, even without getting the 2 elbow surgeries. And even when you look at that list of 4, Daniel Hudson and Drew Rasmussen have had a long list of injuries since they got the second Tommy Johns. Like Rasmussen's had some shoulder stuff. Hudson's had a various number of injuries, even though he's pitched out of the bullpen well into his 30s before retiring this year. But they even had issues, even though there has been effectiveness. So you could look at Means at 31 and say there's really no precedent for a guy to get 2 TJs in less than 3 years and be in his 30s and come back to make any impact in the big leagues. Basically, it has never been done. Could John Means be the first to do it? Maybe he could. He was really good before he got that first surgery. Basically, haven't really seen him pitch for a long stretch at all since that first Tommy John early in the 2022 season. And it's been unfortunate for Means because never really been a consistent part of one of these good winning Orioles teams. He was the ace of the terrible teams, and he's kind of been watching from home and in the dugout since then. And he became a free agent this offseason, which another piece of bad timing to get Tommy John in your free agent season. But depth is depth. And we've seen the Orioles accrue depth with signing Sugano and Charlie Morton to the one-year deals this year at the back end of their rotation. And for John Means, he shouldn't be too expensive. The Orioles know his medicals better than any other team. He knows Baltimore well. He seemed to have liked his time here enough. And maybe it's a possibility. It's not something that I'm going to absolutely scream from the rooftops that the Orioles need to bring back John Means, but I'm very open to the O's making that move. And again, if they make that move, it wouldn't be a move for 2025. Like, yes, it's possible that he's back this year. Like, again, if rehab goes perfectly, maybe after the All-Star break, you could see John Means back on a big league mound. Maybe you get 2 months of a healthy John Means at the end of this season. But if you do bring him in, you're really paying for 2026. If he gets a contract this offseason, it's going to be a 2-year deal. I see no scenario in which a team pays him for 1 year just to get at best 2 months, and knowing there's a scenario where he has a setback and he can't pitch at all in 2025. So he's going to get a 2-year deal that's probably backloaded for when he's healthy. So I think a deal that looks something like 2 years, $10 million, where he basically gets $1 or $2 million this year to fully rehab, and then $8 or $9 million for 2026 when you assume he's fully healthy, ready to go from opening day that season. And we don't know what John Means is going to be when he comes back. So you're not going to be counting on him to be one of your top 3 starters like he used to be. But 2 years, $10 million, even if it's $8 million for 2026, it's a good price for a depth starter or even a solid swingman. Like when Means first came up in 2019, he was a good reliever out of the bullpen before the Orioles finally moved him into the rotation, and he ended up having that great rookie season. We know he can work out of the bullpen potentially, and his stuff frustrates guys with that fastball changeup combination. It's fun to watch. And if he's never the same, if you give him a deal like that, the money's, again, very low risk on a 2-year, $10 million contract, which would really be more like a 1-year, $8 million deal once he would get back and healthy. And those kind of deals are very, very low risk. And when you're also looking at, hey, this is mostly a move for 2026. If you did it for 2025, any innings you got out of Means would be gravy at the end of the year. This is the Orioles rotation for 2026 if you projected it right now. Kyle Bradish coming off Tommy John. There's a chance he doesn't pitch at all in 25. Grayson Rodriguez, number 2. Dean Kramer, number 3. Cade Povich, number 4. And Tyler Wells also coming off Tommy John as your number 5 starter with Trevor Rogers at 6 and Chase McDermott at 7 behind them. I mean, maybe you could argue you throw Albert Suarez in at number 5 instead of Tyler Wells and push everybody down. That's a possibility as well. But like, the Orioles have signed some guys, but we know Zach Eflin, Morton, Sugano, all set to be free agents after this year. So the O's need to start thinking about pitching for 2026 and beyond. And at least a deal for Means, hey, comes back healthy, could be a back-end starter for that team and help you out too. So again, it's not something I'm completely pounding the table for. I still think he's going to sign a 2-year deal with the Kansas City Royals. That's where he's from. That's where he lives in the offseason. I just think it makes sense for him to be there, rehab. They need some back-end starters. Bringing him in, I think, would be smart for both sides with the Royals. But it makes sense for the O's. And if they want to do it, it should be cheap. If he wants to come back, I'm certainly not opposed to giving John Means another chance in Baltimore. But whether or not the Orioles get John Means to potentially help them out in the rotation, we unfortunately know at this point they're not going to get Roki Sasaki in their rotation. He has made it clear who his finalists are, and one of them, not the Orioles. So let's talk about coming up next, how that impacts the O's, what teams he could sign with, and a couple other small pieces of news and notes to finish out the show. So let's talk Roki Sasaki. We are here on January 14th. Tomorrow, Wednesday, January 15th, opens up the 2025 international signing period. And Roki Sasaki's posting date ends on January 23rd. Because Sasaki is subject to being in this international signing period because he wanted to leave Japan before turning 25, the agreement between NPB and MLB is that once a player turns 25, they can be posted by their Japanese team and they basically can become a free agent in MLB. They can sign a big contract, and there's also a big posting fee that the major league team pays to the Japanese team to basically get their player. But if a guy is not 25 yet, he has to have the team agree to post him. Once he's 25, he can just say, post me, and they have to do it. If he's under 25, it's all up to the team. And Sasaki is not 25 years old yet. So there was some disagreements between him and his team in Japan, but they agreed to post him early. And because of that, he can't be a regular posted international free agent. He instead goes into the group along with the 16-year-old kids in the Dominican Republic who teams are signing to $1 and $2 million bonus deals of their, 11, 12, $13 million international bonus pools that they get each year. We'll see the Orioles make an announcement on Wednesday of all of their players that they've signed. But for the O's and really other teams, Sasaki was this interesting piece because he was coming over knowing he wasn't going to get more than, $8 or $9 million maximum for his bonus. It was less about the money because he was in that pool, and it was more about where he wanted to play. And Joel Wolf, his agent, talked a lot about how, hey, Sasaki, didn't love being in a big media market in Japan. Maybe he wants to go to a smaller market team, focused on good pitching development. It's not just going to go to the Dodgers. Things like that is what we heard. And now the reporting is that Roki Sasaki is down to his 3 finalists. And it sounds like we will get a decision basically between Wednesday and next Thursday. And I would think probably at some point this weekend, Sasaki will make his move. He's down to 3 finalists. And surprise, surprise, it's the Los Angeles Dodgers, the San Diego Padres, and a little surprisingly, the Toronto Blue Jays are the third team in that mix. And we know that 20 of the 30 teams sent a proposal to Sasaki's camp. You have to imagine the Orioles were one of those teams. They could absolutely use Sasaki. At most, it seems like 10 teams got meetings with Sasaki. And at least for what's been reported at this point, the Orioles were not one of those teams. Now, the Michael Eyes front office pretty tight-lipped, so they could have gotten a meeting and it just never got out. It's certainly a possibility, but not going to get the meeting. You're not going to sign him. And it kind of seems like a lot of that small market stuff was pretty much smoke and mirrors by Joel Wolf, Sasaki's agent, because Dodgers, Padres, Blue Jays, the Padres are a little different, but the Padres are on the West Coast and they've had a long line, especially recently, of bringing in Japanese players, and they seem to be a front runner from the beginning. But Yu Darvish, somewhat of a mentor to Roki Sasaki, he's on the Padres. Some of this seemed like, again, a little bit of smoke and mirrors, a little bit of a sham, this whole process, that it was probably going to be Dodgers, Padres from the jump. And honestly, from the Orioles' sake, I guess if he signs with the Dodgers, it's fine. The rich get richer. It's not going to make fans happy, whatever. It doesn't have a huge impact on the Orioles. We don't want him signing with the Blue Jays because that team's kind of a disaster right now, and he gives them hope, and that's 6 years of an awesome pitcher you got to face in division, so you'd rather him not sign with Toronto. The perfect place for Sasaki to sign from an Orioles standpoint is the San Diego Padres. And it's not just that, hey, he signs in the NL West, you'll rarely have to see him. In the postseason, won't have to worry about him until the World Series. Padres are in a weird spot. Maybe he doesn't make a huge playoff impact anyway. The big reason why I want Sasaki to sign with the Padres is that the Padres are going through this weird ownership change. Peter Seidler's death. We know there's a lawsuit from Seidler's wife to Seidler's brothers about who should own the team. Sound familiar to you? Sounds like the Angelos family from a couple of years ago before they eventually sold. So the Padres are in kind of some limbo. They already were trying to shed some payroll. And we know that there was a possibility of them trading guys like Dylan Cease or Luis Ariz this offseason, maybe Robert Suarez, their closer, as those guys get more expensive and closer to free agency. But the Padres on the flip side, even though they're trying to shed payroll, they also still want to win. Like, this is still a very talented roster with the likes of Manny Machado and Fernando Tatis Jr., and, they didn't bring back Jerks and Profar yet, but they should. And Jackson Merrill and Xander Bogaerts. And you've still got a good rotation with Yu Darvish and Dylan Cease for now and Michael King and these guys. And this team's still trying to win. They still think they can win a World Series with this roster, but they do need to shed a little payroll. So if the Padres get Roki Sasaki, who would be on basically a league minimum salary for the next 3 years and could potentially be pitching it at an all-star level for that amount of money, that makes it actually easier for the Padres to trade someone like a Dylan Cease or even a Michael King, two of their top starting pitchers in their rotation. Because at this point, King and Cease are both free agents after this year. I think they want to work out an extension with King. It feels like the writing's on the wall. They're not going to extend or bring back Dylan Cease. He's getting paid $14 or $15 million this year. They want to shed payroll. They're not going to bring him back. Kind of a perfect trade for them to make to get his money off the books now and get something for him before he just leaves in free agency next year. And if you get Roki Sasaki, in theory, you get a much cheaper version. He's not going to be Dylan Cease from the jump, but you think pretty shortly he can give you what Dylan Cease gives you on the mound. That's how good Sasaki is. So actually that move would make it more likely for the Padres to make one of those deals because they can say, we can replace Cease with Sasaki. We can still get a young arm back from a team like the Orioles in a trade. And we get that $14 million due to Dylan Cease off the books, which gives us a little more flexibility payroll-wise and where we want to get to. So as an Orioles fan, you should be cheering for him to pick San Diego because I think that trade of a Dylan Cease becomes all that much more likely if that move goes through. Now, overall, this process just has been weird. Like Roki Sasaki should not be in the same pool of players, again, that those 16-year-olds in the Dominican Republic are. Now that's its own completely screwed up system that is a whole nother 5-episode series to talk about how messed up that entire international amateur system is. But Sasaki should not be in the same pool. And there's been a lot of talk about how because Sasaki, he's not going to be here for all the money. Again, he's capped out at like 10 or 11 million, depending on what a pool is that a team has to give him. But teams are going to be willing. They have these handshake agreements with players. Now they can't officially sign them until tomorrow, but they've had handshake agreements for 1 million, 2 million, 1.7 million for the last 2 years. And they've spread out their $13 million total they are allotted to sign international free agents. The thought is that teams are breaking those handshake deals to clear up more money to be able to offer Roki Sasaki officially when that new period opens tomorrow. And we've already seen some reporting that the Dodgers broke an agreement with a player and the Pirates came in and gave him like $500,000 more and they signed with him instead. And that might happen more and more with guys who are signed with, or at least agreed with the Dodgers and the Padres right now as they try to clear up more of that international bonus pool money to give to Roki Sasaki. And it's just a messed up system in that way that some guys could be left behind who thought they had $1 million deals to change their lives. And also just the process of him coming over, like the reason that the posting age is 25 from NPB is that Japanese teams don't want to bring up these great young Japanese stars, have them play for them for 1 year, show they're awesome, and then just leave for MLB and not get all the fanfare, merchandising money that comes with having a guy like that play for you for 4, 5, 6 years, whatever it may be. But also with more interest in players in Japan, more talent in that league in Japan, more and more NPB guys are going to want to go over to Major League Baseball and at a younger age. Like back in the day, even when great stars came over, they waited until their late 20s, their 30s to come to MLB. Guys like Shohei Ohtani and Roki Sasaki and Yoshinobu Yamamoto and others are going to want to come to MLB at earlier ages because they have the tools and the skills to do so. So making guys wait until they're 25, when some of them turn pro at 19 or 20 and play in NPB and start showing off their skills, it just doesn't make sense for either side. You get these disagreements like Sasaki had with his team. You get these weird spots where they're in the same money pool with 16-year-olds from Venezuela. Like, it's just not the best system. And I know it could hurt NPB teams from a value perspective and having their own players, but just lower the posting age from like 25 to 22 or 23. Then guys can leave earlier and the NPB teams can get those bigger posting fees if they become real free agents earlier. Something has to change because you can't have a situation like this Sasaki thing with a player this good come up again. And it will come up again if the rules continue to look like this. Now, couple more pieces of news and notes to get to. First, I mentioned that Blake Hunt was DFA'd to get Andrew Kittredge on the roster. The Orioles also claimed Roansy Contreras, the right-handed pitcher, over the weekend off waivers. I talked about him on Sunday's episode as well. You can go back and check that one out. But they also had to make a 40-man room for that. And for that one, they DFA'd utility man Liván Soto, who the Orioles claimed on waivers 3 different times in 2024. Last time was coming over at the trade deadline from the Reds. Left-handed hitter with options who can play all around the infield and in the corner outfield. He's got a good contact approach. And he had a little bit of MLB time with the Orioles when they were so injured down the stretch last year. Soto got some time. Didn't play a lot. Was on the bench for a while. He was 3 for 13 in the big leagues with the O's with a double, 3 walks, and 3 strikeouts. He hit pretty well in a handful of games in AAA Norfolk when he was there as well. There's really no power in that bat, so there's a certain ceiling that Soto's going to hit, but he's a 24-year-old utility guy with options and MLB experience. I think there's a good chance Soto gets claimed by another team. It's happened plenty of times for him over the last year or so since the Angels, who called him up initially in 2022, DFA'd him. He'll most likely find another home. You know the Orioles will want him to clear waivers. Mike Elias clearly likes him, considering, again, he acquired him 3 different times last year. He's probably going to want to bring him back, even if he ends up on another team at some point. But my thought is that he'll be somewhere else. And as I mentioned, Brian Baker and Emmanuel Rivera have survived for now as Liván Soto and Blake Hunt get DFA'd. Another guy that was DFA'd recently was Rene Pinto. He got the designation for assignment when the Orioles signed Charlie Morton. Pinto was a catcher who the O's had claimed from the Rays earlier this offseason, but he would have been in the mix for backup or third catcher. But once Gary Sanchez was signed, Pinto's out of options, which makes it really tough for him to be catcher number 3. He was much more expendable. That was an easy DFA. Well, he's been claimed by the Diamondbacks on waivers, so he will not be clearing waivers and staying in the Orioles system. So they will not have catcher depth in Pinto, who's been in the bigs with the Rays for a few years as their second or third catcher. And finally, Burch Smith has found a new home. The right-handed pitcher signed a minor league deal with the Pittsburgh Pirates this week. Smith, who started last year with the Marlins and was solid but was DFA'd in the middle of the year. He was signed by the Orioles and debuted with Baltimore in that series against the Yankees in July, right before the All-Star break. And he was really good when he first joined the Orioles. Had a 2.16 ERA out of the Oriole bullpen in July. His fastball velo jumped 2 miles per hour from the Marlins to the Orioles. It was like, this guy's got good stuff. They could have found something here. Well, his stuff was still good, but he ran into a gigantic home run problem for the rest of the year. Over the final 2 months of the season, he was not good. And specifically in his final 16 appearances for the Orioles, he posted an 8.10 ERA. His strikeout rate went down, the gigantic homer problem. I would have been fine with the Orioles bringing him back on a minor league deal to put him in AAA as depth, let him compete for a spot. But the Orioles bullpen is kind of crowded at this point. Burch Smith signing with the Pirates gives him a much easier path to get a major league bullpen spot. So I absolutely understand why he signed with Pittsburgh, and we wish him well after his time in Baltimore in 2024. But that'll do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. We will be back on Thursday, although there will be a lot of kind of info out there about international signings and things like that. Won't get to it on Thursday. May come back Friday with an episode about that. But Thursday, we're going to take a look at Cade Povich's rookie season in 2024. What went right? What went wrong? And really, with the Orioles rotation kind of filling up, we'll talk about, is there a spot for Povich to make an impact in the rotation in 2025? That's coming up on Thursday's episode. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.